The morning Ellen Collins woke without her father's pistol beneath her pillow was the morning she understood, for the first time in 6 years, that something had quietly changed inside her chest without asking her permission. She lay still for a long moment, staring up at the raw wood beams of her bedroom ceiling, listening to the early birds carrying on beyond the window glass, and she let her right hand drift slowly across the cool cotton of the pillow beside her head. Her fingers found nothing but the faint depression where the Colt had rested for 2,190 nights in a row, more or less, not that she had ever counted on purpose. She simply knew. The way a person knows the weight of grief, not because they measure it each morning, but because it is always there, pressing down, and then one day the pressure shifts, and the absence of it is somehow louder than the thing itself ever was. She sat up slowly and looked across the small bedroom. The Colt Navy revolver sat on the washstand, barrel pointed at the wall, just as she had placed it the previous evening before she climbed into bed. She remembered doing it. She remembered thinking, almost without thought, that she did not need it close tonight, and then she had pulled the quilt over her shoulder and closed her eyes and slept a long, dreamless, peaceful sleep. 6 years. She pulled the quilt aside and set her bare feet on the cold pine floor, and sat there a moment with the early October light of 1882 coming thin and gold through the curtain. 6 years since Thomas Collins had been taken from her by a fever that swept through Redemption Creek, Texas, the summer their boy was just past 3 years old. 6 years since her father had pressed the Colt into her hands and said, "You are alone now, Ellen, and this land does not forgive women who are not ready for it." 6 years since she had learned, without anyone having to teach her particularly hard, that her father was exactly right. And 4 years since her father himself had gone, leaving her the pistol and his 50 acres, and the opinion of every woman in town who thought she ought to remarry before the land ate her alive. She had not remarried. She had learned to plow. She had learned to mend fences in the driving February wind, and to haggle at the feed store, and to look men in the eye at the bank in a way that made them uncomfortable enough to leave her alone. She had raised her son, James, who was now 9 years old and already serious and capable in the way that children raised close to hard work always are. And every single night, without exception, she had slept with the Colt Navy under her pillow. She asked herself, sitting on the edge of the bed, why she had not done so last night. The answer arrived without any fanfare at all. It was simply there, the way a person's own name is there when someone calls it. Edwin Easton. She pressed her lips together and stood up and crossed to the washstand and lifted the pistol and checked its loads with the practiced ease of a woman who had done it so many thousands of times she no longer had to think about the steps. Then she set it down again and poured water from the pitcher into the basin and began to wash her face. In the small, age-spotted mirror above the washstand, she looked at herself honestly. 31 years old. Dark hair with the first gray threading above her left ear. Sun-dark skin across her nose and cheekbones from every season she had spent working outdoors. Green eyes that people used to call pretty when she was younger and now they simply called direct, which she thought was probably more useful anyway. She looked like what she was, a woman who had survived things. Edwin Easton. She exhaled slowly and reached for the towel. She had met him 43 days ago, and she knew it was 43 because she was a woman who kept a careful account of things she could not entirely explain to herself. He had arrived in Redemption Creek in mid-August of 1882, riding a good gray horse and leading a loaded pack mule, and the first thing she had noticed about him was that he stopped his horse in the middle of Main Street to let a stray dog cross, rather than riding around it or letting it scramble out of his way. She had been standing on the porch of the general store at the time, waiting for Horace grimly to finish wrapping her flour order, and she had watched Edwin Easton watch the dog cross the street, and she had thought, with the part of herself that still noticed things like this even when she preferred not to, that a man who was patient with a stray dog was either a genuinely good man or an extremely clever one. She had found out soon enough, because Redemption Creek was not a large town. 2 streets of buildings, a church, a school where James attended 3 days a week, a livery, a bank that made her blood pressure rise every time she had to visit it, a saloon she never entered, and approximately 240 people of varying degrees of persistence and honesty. A new man arriving and settling was not an unremarkable event, but Edwin Easton had made a particular impression because he had paid cash for the disused smithy at the north end of Main Street and had it hammering and ringing within a week. He was a blacksmith. 34 years old, she had learned through the ordinary mechanisms of small-town information, which was to say that Martha Hale from the dry goods store had told her everything within the first 10 days, including that he was unmarried, that he was from somewhere in Missouri, and that he had forearms like fence posts, which Martha felt was a relevant detail, and which Ellen had privately agreed was not entirely without merit. She had needed a harness repaired. It was as simple as that. The left trace on her work harness had cracked in a way that the saddler in town said he could not reliably fix before the harvest work, and someone had mentioned the new smith might take on leather work until his actual smithy business built up. She had walked down to the smithy on a Tuesday morning with the cracked harness over her shoulder and pushed open the door. He had been at the forge, his back to her, and the shop had been full of heat and the clean iron smell of heated metal and the rhythmic sound of the hammer, and she had stood in the doorway for a moment before calling out, and in that moment she had simply registered him as a working man in his element, which was its own particular thing to witness. He was tall, broad through the shoulder in the way that actual physical labor makes a man rather than in the way vanity does. Dark hair that was a little too long at the back, curling with the sweat of the work. When he turned at her call, she saw that his face was honest. That was the word she landed on, standing in the hot doorway with the harness over her shoulder. Honest. Not handsome in any theatrical sense, but the kind of face that showed clearly what it was thinking, which she found, after years of reading men for self-preservation, to be an unexpectedly arresting quality. He had set down the hammer and come to the door, wiping his hands on the leather apron he wore, and he had looked at the harness, and then at her with a directness that matched her own. "I can fix this," he had said. "Be a few days," and she had said, "I need it by Friday," and he had said, "Then it will be done by Thursday." And she had said, "Good," and told him her name, and he had told her his, and she had walked back up Main Street feeling oddly off balance, the way a person feels when something small shifts in a way that seems disproportionate to the shift itself. He had the harness done by Wednesday. She had come to collect it, and he had walked her through what he had done, not because she asked, but because he apparently assumed she would want to know, which she did, and which not many people assumed about her. He showed her where the leather had been stressed and why, and explained how he had reinforced it, and she had listened and asked 2 questions, and he had answered them without any condescension whatsoever, which was, in her experience, rarer than it ought to have been. She had paid him and taken the harness and gone home, and that night she had lain in the dark with the Colt under her pillow and thought about how a man could say, "I can fix this," with that particular quality of quiet competence, and make it sound like a statement of genuine fact rather than a performance. After that, they kept encountering each other, as people do in small towns, where the geography of daily life keeps pushing people together in the feed store and the post office, and along the single road that runs the length of the place. They talked, because it was natural to talk, and because she discovered that Edwin Easton was a man who listened when she spoke, which was a thing she had learned to notice the absence of. He asked her about her farm. Not in the way of a man deciding whether something was worth his attention, but in the way of a person who was genuinely curious about how another person had built their life. He asked about her crops and her soil and her well, and she answered, and he answered her questions in return when she asked them, which she found herself doing more than she intended. He had been in Missouri, she learned gradually, for most of his adult life. He had learned the smith's trade from his uncle and built a solid business there. And then his business partner had turned out to be dishonest in a thorough and catastrophic way. And Edwin had sold what remained, settled his debts with the uncompromising honesty that seemed to be his central characteristic, and come west, because west was where a man went when he needed to start over and did not want to do it surrounded by the people who had watched him fail, however unfairly. She understood that particular feeling very well. He had never been married. She had found this out not from Martha, whose information on this point was uncertain, but from Edwin himself, on an afternoon in late September when they had both happened to stop at the creek, crossing on the South Road at the same time. She coming back from delivering eggs to the McAllister place. He coming back from collecting some iron stock he had ordered up from San Antonio. Their horses had drunk from the creek together, and they had stood on the bank in the warm late September air, and talked for the better part of an hour without either of them seeming to notice the time passing. She had asked him, simply because the conversation had arrived at a point where the question was natural, whether he had family he had left behind in Missouri. He had said, "No wife, if that is what you mean," and smiled in a way that was self-aware rather than defensive, and she had felt the back of her neck grow warm in a way that she chose to attribute to the afternoon sun. He had asked about James, her son, whom he had seen in town, and she had told him about Thomas, matter-of-factly, because she was a woman who dealt in facts, and he had listened without offering the particular variety of well-meaning platitude that people so often reached for when the subject of a dead husband came up, and she had been grateful for that in a way she could not have entirely articulated. 43 days since she had first walked into his smithy with a cracked harness. And this morning, for the first time in 6 years, she had not needed the pistol close. Ellen tied her hair back and went to make breakfast, pushing Edwin Easton firmly to one side of her mind, while she fried salt pork and boiled coffee, and called for James to come down from the loft where he slept. Her son appeared on the ladder with his hair every which way and his boots in one hand, and she watched him cross the kitchen floor with a fierce, quiet love that she thought was probably the truest thing inside her, and she put his plate in front of him and sat across the table with her coffee and thought about what needed doing. The garden needed the last of its picking before the cold came down. The fence on the north side of the property had 2 posts that were leaning and would not survive a hard winter standing that way. The well rope was fraying at the bucket end, and she had been meaning to replace it. James needed new boots. She could see his right big toe trying to make an acquaintance with the outside world through the leather of the current ones, and she needed to go to town for the flour she had been planning to order for 2 weeks. "Mama," James said, pushing his eggs around his plate in the way he did when he was thinking about something, "is Mr. Easton going to come out and look at the chimney?" She set her coffee down. "Why would Mr. Easton come out to look at the chimney?" "Because I told him it was making that noise again," James said, apparently finding this self-explanatory. She looked at her son carefully. James was 9 years old and had her own green eyes and his father's light hair and a steadiness about him that she prided herself on, but he was also 9 years old, which meant that he did things with a child's logic that occasionally produced consequences she had not anticipated. "When did you speak to Mr. Easton about the chimney?" "Last Thursday when I was in town with Billy McAllister," James said. "We went to see him shoe a horse. He said he would come out and look if you wanted. He said chimneys sometimes need new iron fittings on the flashing and that he could check it." "You should have told me," Ellen said. James looked up at her. "Would you have asked him yourself?" She opened her mouth and then closed it again, because her 9-year-old son had just asked her a question that was, she was forced to admit, entirely reasonable, and the honest answer was that she probably would not have, and they both appeared to know it. "I will think about it," she said, which was her standard diplomatic answer to questions she had not sorted out yet. James, with the shrewd perception of a child who had been raised by a single parent, and had therefore learned to read adult conversational subtext very early, nodded as though this meant yes, and went back to his eggs. She went to town that morning with the wagon and James riding beside her on the bench, his legs dangling, pointing out a hawk above the east field, and then falling into the companionable silence that was one of the things she liked best about him. Redemption Creek sat in a flat sweep of South Texas land, where the sky was a dome so vast and so blue in October that it was almost aggressive, and the mesquite and cedar stood against it with a ragged, determined sort of beauty. Ellen had been born 40 miles north of here and had lived in this country her whole life, and still sometimes it caught her, a particular slant of light, or the smell of the land after a brief rain, or the way the sky looked at the moment the sun cleared the horizon, and she would feel something move in her that she could not name, a species of gratitude or grief or both at once. She left James at the general store where he had, predictably, positioned himself near the jar of hard candy on the counter in a way that was casual but strategic, and she went around the back of the store to speak with Horace about the flour order. That took 20 minutes, and then she went to the post office, where there was a letter from her sister in Fort Worth, and she tucked it in her pocket to read later when she had time to give it her full attention. She was coming back along Main Street with the wagon when she saw Edwin Easton standing outside the livery with Frank Dawes, the livery owner, looking at a buckboard wheel that had clearly come to some grief. She could see from 20 yards away that the wheel was cracked at the hub. She knew this because she was a woman who had learned to assess the condition of wagon parts the way she had learned everything else useful in her life, which was to say by necessity. She would have gone directly to the wagon and continued about her business. She genuinely would have. But Edwin looked up at the sound of the wagon and lifted a hand in the direct, easy greeting of a man who was simply glad to see someone, and something in her chest did that thing it had been doing lately, which was an uncomfortable loosening, like a knot that has been tight so long it has forgotten how to release and finds the releasing almost worse than the holding. She pulled up and climbed down, because it would have been rude not to, and walked over. Frank Dawes greeted her with the slightly nervous respect he had developed for her over the years since she had once corrected him on the price of oats in a way that left him no dignified room to dispute her, and then he excused himself to get something from inside, which left her and Edwin standing beside the broken wheel in the morning sunlight. "Hub crack," she said, nodding at the wheel. "All the way through," Edwin confirmed. "Frank's hoping I can save it, but I do not think the wood is worth saving at this point. Better to replace the hub entirely." He looked at her, then at her wagon behind her. "How is the harness holding?" "Perfectly," she said, and meant it. "You did good work." "You would tell me if it was otherwise, I think," he said, and the smile that went with this was the kind that happened in the eyes before the mouth caught up with it. She thought, standing in the October sunlight outside the Redemption Creek livery, that she was in some considerable amount of trouble. "My son tells me he spoke to you about our chimney," she said, because it was better to address it directly than to let it sit. Edwin looked briefly amused. "He did. He is a thorough young man." "He is occasionally more thorough than I would prefer," she said. "The offer stands," Edwin said, and his voice was easy and without pressure. "If you would like me to come out and look at the flashing, no obligation. I would not want you to feel that the boy put you in an awkward position." "He did," she said frankly, "but the chimney probably does need looking at, so he may be forgiven for it this once." She was quiet for a moment. "Would Saturday afternoon work? I will have the harvest chores done by midday." "Saturday afternoon," Edwin said. "That works fine." She nodded and said goodbye and climbed back onto her wagon and drove up the street, and she did not look back. But she could feel his eyes on her back for a moment before she turned the corner, and she thought, "I am 31 years old, and I survived 6 years alone, and a fever that took my husband and a grief that took my father, and I have kept a pistol under my pillow every night through all of it. And right now I am nervous about a man coming to look at a chimney on Saturday afternoon." And she could not quite decide whether this was humiliating or, in some deeply unfamiliar way, wonderful. On the drive home, James asked her whether she had seen Mr. Easton in town, with a studied casualness that was not remotely convincing, and she told him yes, and that Edwin would come on Saturday. And James nodded with evident satisfaction and went back to looking at the hawk that was still riding the thermals above the east field, or possibly a different hawk. She could not tell. She thought her son was already a better matchmaker than he would ever be properly thanked for, assuming any of this came to anything, which she was not at all certain it would. The next 2 days she worked. The garden was picked bare, and the last of the tomatoes were put up in glass jars that she lined on the cellar shelf with the particular satisfaction of a woman who understands that what she does in autumn she will eat in February. She repaired the fence posts with 2 days of digging and tamping and muscle that left her back aching in the evening. She braided a new rope for the well bucket from a length of hemp rope she had in the barn. She let James help with the tomatoes, which meant the process took longer and was more enjoyable, and she read her sister Clara's letter on Thursday evening by lamplight. Clara had married a physician in Fort Worth and lived a life that was comfortable and domestic and completely different from Ellen's, and they loved each other with a devotion made of genuine affection and the particular understanding that comes from having grown up in the same house. Clara's letter was full of news about her 2 children and her garden and the new church her husband had helped fund. And at the end, because Clara was Clara, she had written, "I hope you are not lonely out there, Ellen. I know you say you are fine, and I believe you that you are managing, but managing and being fine are not the same thing, and you deserve more than just managing." Ellen folded the letter and held it in her lap for a while in the lamplight, and listened to James breathing in his sleep above her in the loft, and thought that her sister was not wrong. Saturday came with the slow ceremony of a fine October day, the sky cloudless and the air carrying that particular crisp quality that appears in South Texas only for a few weeks before winter proper arrives, sharp enough to be invigorating but not yet cold enough to be punishing. Ellen finished her midday chores, changed into a clean dress, and then stood in front of the mirror and felt ridiculous for changing into a clean dress, and then changed back into her work dress, and then stood there again and compromised by changing into the clean dress that was not the work dress, but was also not the dress she wore to church on Sundays. She was aware that this process was embarrassing and was grateful that James was outside and not witnessing it. Edwin arrived in mid-afternoon on his gray horse, and James, who had apparently been watching for him from the barn loft with the dedication of a military lookout, appeared from the barn at a barely concealed run and met him at the fence gate. She watched from the porch as her son held the gate open, and Edwin swung down from the horse and shook James's hand, man to man, with a naturalness that made something in her chest hurt in the very best kind of way. They came up to the porch together, James talking at speed about the chimney and also, apparently, about the hawk that had been above the east field, which James had decided was living there now. Edwin listened to all of this with what appeared to be genuine interest, which she appreciated more than she could have easily expressed, because the world was full of adults who listened to children with the condescension of people waiting for the children to stop, and Edwin was not among them. "Mrs. Collins," he said, removing his hat when he reached the porch steps. "Mr. Easton," she said, "come inside. The chimney gives trouble mostly in the north corner of the house." She showed him to the fireplace in the main room, and he crouched in front of it and studied the flashing where the chimney met the ceiling, and then went outside and looked up at it from the yard, and James trailed him with complete devotion. Edwin was thorough. He asked her when it had last been swept, whether the noise was a rattling or a hissing, whether it only happened in high wind. She answered each question and watched him think, and there was something deeply calming about watching a person who was competent and careful at what they did. "The iron collar has worked loose," he said, coming back inside and brushing his hands on his trousers. "It needs to be reseated and a new rivet in 2 places. It will take me maybe 2 hours when I bring the right tools. Nothing serious. You will not lose heat this winter." "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate you coming out." "It is no trouble," he said, and then James said, "Mama, can Mr. Easton stay for supper?" in the direct way of children who have not yet learned the social convention of going around the long way to a question. There was a brief silence. Ellen looked at her son, who looked back at her with green eyes that were entirely too much like her own for her to pretend to misread them. Then she looked at Edwin, who was looking at his hat brim in a way that was carefully neutral, and she thought, "He is giving me the way out if I want it," and then she thought, "I do not want it. If Mr. Easton does not have somewhere to be," she said, "he is welcome to stay." Edwin looked up. "I would like that," he said simply. She cooked. She made a beef and potato stew from the last of the beef she had salted, and cornbread, and opened one of the jars of apple preserves that she saved for occasions. And she worked in the kitchen while Edwin and James sat on the porch in the late afternoon light, and she could hear James's voice and Edwin's deeper one in the easy back and forth of a conversation she did not strain to hear, because it was not hers to hear, and because the sound of it, the simple, warm, ordinary sound of her son talking to a man who was listening, was enough just as a sound. They ate at the kitchen table, the three of them, with the lamp lit against the early fall dark that had begun to come down by 6:30. James talked about school and the hawk and the hawk's possible nest, which he had located in the dead elm along the creek, and Edwin asked questions with the focused interest of a man who thought the hawk's nest was a genuinely worthwhile subject. Ellen ate and listened and said things when she had things to say, and felt, with an odd and almost disorienting sensation, that this was easy. The ease of it was what surprised her most, not forced or performed or negotiated, simply easy. After supper, James was sent to wash up and given fair warning that bed was in his near future, and he went without the negotiation he sometimes attempted, which she thought was interesting. Edwin helped her carry the dishes to the wash basin without being asked, and she did not tell him he did not need to, because she had no interest in performing the ritual of declining help she actually wanted. They washed dishes together. It was a practical and simple activity, and it was also, somehow, intimate in the way that shared ordinary tasks can be, when the person sharing them is the right one. Washed and she dried, and their hands were close in the water a few times, and neither of them made anything of it, and the not making anything of it felt more significant than making something of it would have. "This is a good place," he said, handing her a bowl. "You have built something real here." "My father helped me start it," she said. "The rest I managed." "It shows," he said, and she could tell he meant both parts of that sentence. She dried the bowl and set it on the shelf. "Why Texas?" she asked. "You could have gone anywhere west, Wyoming, Colorado. Why here?" He was quiet for a moment, washing the last of the cups. "My father was from Texas," he said. "Not this part. Further east, near the Louisiana border. He died when I was 11. I always thought I would come see it eventually, and when I needed a place to start over, it felt right to finally come." She thought about a man carrying a father around inside him for 23 years and finally coming to see the country the father was from. She thought this was the kind of thing that told you something real about a person. "I am sorry about your father," she said. "I am sorry about your husband," he said, and the way he said it was even and simple and without the quality of awkwardness that usually accompanied condolences 6 years after the fact, as though he were simply acknowledging a real thing rather than performing a social obligation. "Thank you," she said. "He was a good man. The fever took a lot of good men that summer." She folded the dish towel. "I kept my father's pistol under my pillow every night after Thomas died. My father gave it to me when I was left alone, and he said it was for protection, and it was. But I think it was also because it made me feel less alone to have something of his clothes. And then when he died too, I kept it because of both of them." She was not sure why she had told him this. She almost never told people this. It was one of those private facts about her life that she kept in the part of herself that was only hers. Edwin had gone still beside her, listening. He was looking at the dish towel in her hands rather than at her face, which she suspected he had calculated correctly was the easier way to receive something a person was not quite sure they meant to give. "Last night," she said quietly, "I put it on the washstand instead." He looked at her then, and his face had that quality of honest openness she had noticed the first day in the smithy, and there was something in his expression that was not pity and was not eagerness, but was simply a careful and whole attention that she found at this moment almost more than she could comfortably look at directly. "I asked myself why," she said. "The kitchen was very quiet. The lamp made a soft circle of gold light on the table between them. And," he said, very low, "I thought that was interesting information," she said, which was not a full answer but was as close as she could come at this particular moment, and from the way he looked at her, she thought he understood it perfectly. He left an hour later in the full dark, with his horse breathing steam in the cool air. James had been sent to bed and had gone, remarkably, without protest. Ellen walked Edwin out to the gate and he saddled up, and she stood on the other side of the fence with her arms crossed against the chill and looked up at him on the gray horse. And the stars above Redemption Creek were the kind of stars you can only see when you are far from city light, which is to say they were overwhelming. "I will come fix the chimney next week," he said. "Yes," she said. "And after that," he said, "I would like to call on you properly if you are willing." She thought of 6 years of the pistol under the pillow. She thought of her father's voice, "This land does not forgive women who are not ready for it." She thought of Clara's letter, "You deserve more than just managing." She thought of the morning she had woken up and reached across the pillow and found nothing there, and the way the answer to why had come immediately and without any struggle at all. "I am willing," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, and the expression on his face was something she recognized, across the years and the losses and the careful distance she had kept, as hope, the genuine kind, the kind that does not perform itself but simply exists in a person's face when they think something good might be coming. "Good night, Mrs. Collins," he said. "Good night, Mr. Easton," she said. She watched him ride out of the yard and down the road until the dark took him. Then she went inside and locked the door and climbed the stairs and stood in her bedroom and looked at the Colt Navy on the washstand. She picked it up and checked the loads, as she always did. Then she did not put it under the pillow. She set it back on the washstand, where it stood solid and present and known, her father's hand in it and Thomas's memory around it. And she thought that perhaps a person could honor the things that had kept them alive without needing to clutch them quite so tightly. If something else had quietly, gently, without any drama whatsoever, taken up the particular space those things had been occupying. She slept well. The weeks that followed were the best weeks she had had in longer than she could comfortably account for, and the reason they were good was not only Edwin, though Edwin was a considerable part of it. Part of it was also what Edwin made possible in her, the way the right conditions make a field produce what was always in the soil waiting. She began to notice things she had stopped noticing during the long years of purely functional living, the beauty of the evening light on the mesquite, the specific sound James made when he was reading and found something funny, the pleasure of a good meal eaten without hurry. These things had always been there. She had simply been carrying too much weight to lift her head and see them. Edwin came the following Tuesday to fix the chimney. He brought his tools and the right iron stock and spent 2.5 hours up on the roof and in the fireplace, and James handed tools up to him from below with an earnestness that was almost ceremonial, and by 3 in the afternoon the chimney flashing was secured and the noise was gone. He did not charge her, and she did not argue with him about it the way she would have argued with any other tradesman, which told her something about where things stood. He took supper with them again, and this time she made a proper meal, a roast chicken she had been saving, with the last of the summer squash and a pie made from dried apple that turned out better than she had expected. They sat at the table long after James had gone to bed, talking in the way that people talk when they have been waiting to talk to each other and have suddenly been given the time to do it properly. They talked about his time in Missouri and the business partner who had broken his trust, and she heard the hurt still in it without being amplified or performed, the hurt of a person who had been genuinely honorable and had expected honor in return, and been surprised to find the world did not automatically reward it. She told him about the early years after Thomas died, the learning curve of running the farm alone, the 2 seasons where she had nearly failed to make it work before she had found her footing. She did not soften it or make it more dramatic than it was. She simply told it, and he listened with the particular quality of attention that is a form of respect. He began coming on Saturdays, and then sometimes on Tuesday evenings, and then sometimes he would ride out in the late afternoon on a weekday if he had finished early, and she would be in the garden or the barn, and she would hear the gray horse on the road and feel that loosening in her chest again, and she had largely stopped pretending to herself that she was not glad to see it coming. He was careful with her. She noticed this with a clarity that she appreciated, because she had spent 6 years being a woman alone and had finally calibrated antennae for the difference between a man who was careful and a man who was simply waiting for the right moment to push. Edwin was genuinely careful. He moved at the pace she set without making her feel that he was counting the distance or performing patience. He did not rush her toward anything. He was simply present and warm and consistent and honest, and she found that consistency, that plain reliability of a person who showed up when they said they would and said what they meant was, after everything, the most powerful thing she had encountered. One evening in November, the first hard frost of the season had come down, and the farmyard was white and crunching, and she and Edwin had sat on the porch wrapped in blankets drinking coffee after supper, because they were the kind of people who sat on the porch in the frost if they had a reason to, and James had fallen asleep inside by the fire, and they had watched the stars come out, and Edwin had said, quietly and without preamble, that he thought he was in love with her. She had not answered immediately. She had sat with the coffee warming her hands and the frost making the world very still around them, and she had felt the words settle into the place in herself where she had been keeping something she had not quite named yet. "I think I have been for a while," he said. "I am not saying it to push you in any direction. I am saying it because I do not much like not being honest, and not saying it when it is true feels like a form of dishonesty. You can do with it whatever you need to do." She looked at him in the pale starlight. He was looking at the yard, giving her the out again, the ease of his consideration a pattern by now that she had come to know and trust absolutely. "Edwin," she said. He looked at her. "I think I have been for a while too," she said. The silence after this was the kind of silence that is not empty but full, the kind that 2 people can sit inside together without any need to fill it, and they sat inside it for a while, and then she leaned her shoulder against his, and he was warm through the blanket, and she thought, here is a thing I had stopped expecting, and it is happening anyway, and it is better than I knew to expect. He asked her to marry him at the end of November, on the day after Thanksgiving, which she had spent with the McAllisters and which he had been invited to by the McAllisters at James's suggestion, and she had sat across the long table from him and passed dishes and talked to Frank McAllister's wife about the preserving, and looked up occasionally to find Edwin looking at her with that honest face and that careful attention, and thought yes, already, yes. He asked her the next afternoon when they were walking the fence line on the east side of her property, because he was a man who helped her check fences when he came out now. It had become a natural thing, and she thought she had better answer before he could finish the sentence, and so she did. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He looked at her with an expression that was not triumphant, but was instead something quieter and more profound, the look of a man who is genuinely moved by a gift he has received, and is not sure he has earned but intends to. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood at the fence line in the November cold with the bare mesquite around them and the gray horse standing patient in the middle distance, and she felt, standing there, that this was one of the truest things she had ever been part of. They told James that evening. James, who had been running the long campaign toward this outcome since September with the steady application of a military general who is confident in his strategy, heard the news with a dignity that lasted approximately 4 seconds before dissolving into an expression of such undisguised delight that both she and Edwin laughed at it. And James, who was 9 and had his dignity to think about, attempted to look more restrained, and failed, and she pulled him to her and held him, and he held her back. And over the top of his head, she looked at Edwin and felt something she thought was gratitude and joy in equal measure. They were married in the Redemption Creek Church on the 15th of January, 1883, on a cold, clear day when the sky was that particular shade of winter blue that looks like it goes on forever. The church was small and plain, and decorated with what the women of the town had thought to bring, which included pine boughs and some dried autumn flowers, and a red ribbon that Martha Hale from the dry goods had tied around the end of each pew. Clara came from Fort Worth with her husband and her 2 children for the occasion, and she met Edwin with the thorough, loving scrutiny of a sister who has been worrying from a distance. And she took Ellen aside in the side room of the church before the ceremony and said, "He looks at you like you are something worth looking at." And Ellen said, "Yes, I know." And Clara embraced her with a fierceness that was everything 6 years of worry and hope and sisterly love compressed into a moment. Edwin stood at the front of the church in a good dark coat that she had not seen before, which meant he had bought it new for the occasion, which touched her in a way she could not entirely account for. He looked like himself. That was the thing. He looked like a man who was exactly where he meant to be. James stood beside him because James had asked if he could, and Edwin had said yes immediately, and the 2 of them standing there side by side, the man and the boy, both with the particular steadiness of people who had decided on something and were not going back on it, was a sight that very nearly undid her composure in the doorway of the church before she had even started walking. She walked up the aisle with Clara's husband on her arm in lieu of a father, and Edwin watched her come, and his expression was the most open and honest and full she had ever seen his honest face. And she thought, "I kept a pistol under my pillow for 6 years, and I am walking up the aisle of a church in Texas in January, and I am not afraid at all. And this is the most remarkable thing." The minister spoke the words and they repeated them, and when Edwin said the words, he looked at her and not at the minister, and she looked back at him, and between them the words were not recitation but statement, genuine and unperformed. He took her hand at the ring and his hands were warm and certain, and she felt the simple band of gold go on her finger and thought of all the mornings of the last 6 years, all the reaching under the pillow, all the weight of solitude and necessity, and felt it not erased but transformed, the way things do not need to be erased to be transformed. The way a field under snow is the same field but different entirely. They kissed in front of the Redemption Creek congregation, and Martha Hale made a sound that could only be described as triumphant. And James, standing to Edwin's left, looked profoundly satisfied, and Clara was crying in the second pew in the dedicated way of a woman who has been saving those tears up for some time. There was a wedding supper in the church hall, the tables set with whatever the women of the town had brought, which included a remarkable quantity of food, and a cake that 3 women had apparently spent 2 days constructing, and which James declared the finest thing he had ever eaten with the conviction of a food critic who has formed a definitive opinion. There was fiddle music and people danced on the wooden floor, the same floor Ellen had walked across for 6 years of ordinary church Sundays, but different tonight. Edwin danced with her in the way of a man who was not a natural dancer, but was determined to be a good one, which she found entirely characteristic and entirely endearing, and they moved through the music together until James cut in with 9-year-old ceremony, and danced with his mother while Edwin watched from the side with his arms folded and a look of pure contentment on his face. She thought, dancing with her son, watching her new husband watch them, that contentment was not a small thing. It was not what songs were written about or what made good drama, but she had learned in 6 hard years that contentment was the thing beneath everything else, the thing that let you stand up in the morning without dreading the day, and she had not had it for a long time, and now she did, and it was extraordinary in its quietness. They took James home together that night, their first night as a family, and put him to bed in the loft, and Edwin carried her over the threshold of her own house with a solemnity that was slightly undermined by his hitting the doorframe with her feet, and then laughing about it in a way that made her laugh too. And she thought this was exactly right. The small mishap, the laughter in it, the not being precious about things. They stood in the kitchen in the lamplight when James was asleep, and the house was quiet, and she looked at this man she had married and thought again about the morning she had woken up without the pistol under the pillow. She had kept it there through Thomas's death and her father's death and 6 years of learning to be a woman alone, and the morning she had not was the morning something in her had already, quietly, decided to let go of the posture of being only sufficient to herself. She was glad of the pistol. She was glad of the 6 years. They were hers and they had made her, and she would not have been without them. But she was gladder still of this, of Edwin Easton standing in her kitchen in the lamplight looking at her like she was something worth looking at. She reached up and put her hand against his face, and he turned into it slightly the way people do when they have been waiting for a particular thing without quite admitting they were waiting, and she said quietly, "I am glad you came to Redemption Creek." "So am I," he said. She kissed him, and he kissed her back, and outside the January night was cold and clear, and the stars over the South Texas plain were as extraordinary as they always were, and the Colt Navy revolver sat on the washstand in the bedroom where she had started keeping it, present and known and honored, but no longer the thing between her and the dark. The winter passed the way winters do when they are good ones, with work and warmth and small dailiness that is, accumulated, the substance of a life. Edwin kept the smithy in town and she kept the farm, and there was a rhythm to the days that accommodated both. Him riding out in the mornings when there was work here to do first, her coming into town when she needed to, and the evenings together at the kitchen table with James and his school books and whatever conversation the day had brought in. It was not a life without difficulty. The world did not rearrange itself to be easier simply because she was happier in it. There were hard frosts and a sick calf she and Edwin sat up half the night with before it turned the corner, and a dispute with the bank in February over the terms of a note on the property that required 3 visits to resolve, and which Edwin handled with a cool, quiet persistence that she found deeply satisfying to observe. There were days she was tired and short with James, and days he was short with her, and the ordinary small negotiations of a household learning its new shape. But there was also this, a person to talk to at the end of the day who was interested in what the day had contained, a person who carried half the weight without being asked and without keeping account, a person whose presence at the table made the table different, the way a particular quality of light makes a room different, alters everything in it without changing any of the individual objects. She had forgotten what this was like, or perhaps she had never had it quite this way, even with Thomas, who had been a good man and whom she had loved, but who had died young and whom she had known young, and the life they had been building together had been the beginning of a thing rather than the fullness of one. With Edwin there was fullness. The fullness of 2 formed people finding each other, each carrying their history, each knowing what they wanted and what they did not want, and the particular richness of that, the lack of naivety in it, the choosing each other with full knowledge rather than with the optimism of youth that cannot quite see clearly because it has not yet been properly tested. In April, the spring came down over the Texas land in the way spring comes in that country, sudden and green and almost violent in its insistence after the brown winter, and she planted the kitchen garden with James helping on the days there was no school, and Edwin built her a new cold frame from scrap lumber he had, to extend the growing season at both ends, and she thought, watching him work, that a man who built you a cold frame without being asked was a man who was paying attention to your life. She found out she was expecting in May, and she told Edwin on a warm evening when James was in bed and they were sitting on the porch again, the porch that had become their place of particular conversation, and he went very still when she told him, and then he looked at her with an expression that was overwhelmed and tender and trying very hard to contain itself. And then he reached over and took her hand and held it, and she felt his hand shake slightly, just the once, and then steady. And she thought this was probably the most honest response a human being could give to that particular news. "Are you all right?" he asked first, which was the right question in the right order. "I am fine," she said, "tired but fine." "Good," he said, very quiet. "Good," and then after a moment, "Thank you." She looked at him. "For what?" "For trusting me enough to build a life with me," he said. "I know what you were risking. I know what it cost you to trust again. I am not unaware of it." She held his hand on the porch in the warm May evening and thought that he was right and that it had cost something and that it had been entirely worth paying. "You made it easy," she said. "That is the thing. It was supposed to be hard and you made it easy." "Nothing about you has been hard," he said, which she knew was not entirely true and which she also knew was a statement of his experience rather than a claim about reality, and she chose to receive it the way it was meant. James took the news of the coming baby with a seriousness that was briefly gratifying, and then immediately replaced by an extremely detailed inquiry about whether the baby would sleep in the house or the barn, which she clarified, and whether the baby would need to use his fishing pole, which he was willing to allow but wanted established early, and whether the baby would be a boy or a girl, which she said she could not know yet. And James considered this and said he would not mind either way, which she believed. Because James had his father's even quality and his grandmother's practical temperament, and she thought he would manage the situation with exactly this kind of careful equanimity. Regardless of what it turned out to be, the summer was a good one. Ellen worked the farm through the early months with the modification of someone who knows their limits and adjusts to them without drama, and Edwin handled more of the heavy work without making any fuss about it, and the crops came in well, and the new cold frame worked exactly as he had said it would. She made preserves and he sold them at the smithy for her, because people came to the smithy anyway, and he sold them at a price she set herself, because he knew better than to set it without asking her, and the arrangement was characteristically practical and characteristically mutual. The baby was born in December of 1883, and he was a boy, and they named him Thomas after her first husband and Edwin after his father. So he was Thomas Edwin Easton, which she thought honored the past and the present simultaneously in a way she found exactly right. He came into the world on a cold night with the midwife, Mrs. Fontaine, in attendance, and Edwin outside in the kitchen with James, who was being kept informed of events at a general level and who handled this with considerable composure. And when Mrs. Fontaine came out and said the baby was here and both were fine, Ellen heard Edwin's voice through the wall say something very quiet that she could not make out, but James repeated it later, and what Edwin had said was "Thank God," in the voice of a man who means it absolutely. When Edwin came in and she put the baby in his arms, the expression on his face was something she was glad to have witnessed and would not forget. He held his son with the careful steadiness of a man who knows how to be careful with something precious, and looked at the small, ancient-looking face of the baby with an expression of complete, undramatic love, and then looked up at her where she lay in the bed, and whatever was in his face at that moment she did not have words for and did not try to find them, because some things are beyond language and are better simply received. James came in and looked at his brother with great seriousness and then said, "He is smaller than I thought," which was accurate and which everyone agreed with, and then he went to bed, and Mrs. Fontaine left, and it was just the four of them in the lamplit house on the cold December night, and Ellen held her son and her husband sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and the world outside was dark and vast, and the stars above Redemption Creek were, as always, extraordinary. Thomas Edwin grew. He grew with the particular speed of healthy children in that country, filling out and rounding and developing opinions about things. And James, who had initially approached the question of brotherhood with a scientist's detachment, was entirely undone by the baby by the time Thomas was 4 months old and following James's movements with dark, fascinated eyes. And James could be found regularly making faces at his brother for the express purpose of making him laugh, which Thomas did readily and with great enthusiasm. Ellen watched her 2 sons and her husband in the life they had made together and thought frequently about the years before, not with regret. She did not wish the years away or want them to have been other than what they were. They had made her, those years, the person she was, the person Edwin had found and loved. But she was glad to be on this side of them. She was glad to have put the pistol on the washstand. She still kept the Colt Navy. It lived on the washstand in their bedroom, cleaned and loaded in the way her father had taught her, and she checked it regularly with the discipline of a woman who respected what it represented. Edwin had asked about it early in their marriage, not to question it but out of genuine interest, and she had told him the whole story, her father pressing it into her hands the night after Thomas died, the 6 years of keeping it under the pillow, the morning she had put it on the washstand and understood why. He had listened to the whole of it and then said, "It is a good pistol and your father was a good father," and left it there, which was exactly the right response. In the spring of 1885, when Thomas Edwin was 16 months old and beginning to move through the house at speed on determined, unsteady legs with the expression of a person who has recently discovered locomotion and finds it thrilling, Edwin came home one evening with a different quality about him, a slight formality that she recognized as meaning he had something on his mind that he was organizing before he said it. She put supper on the table and waited. After James had been sent upstairs and Thomas had been put to bed after considerable negotiation, because Thomas was at an age where bedtime was a matter of protest on principle, Edwin sat down across from her at the kitchen table and folded his hands on the table and said, "I have been thinking about the land." She knew immediately what he meant. The 50 acres her father had left her were good land, well watered for that country, with productive soil in the low sections and solid grazing on the slope. But they were also bordered on the east by the Harlan property, which had been empty for 3 years since old Marcus Harlan had died without heirs and whose estate was being slowly resolved by lawyers in San Antonio. Edwin had been watching it. "The Harlan land," she said. 120 acres, he said. "The East Creek feeds right into our property line. The house is sound. I looked at it last fall. It needs work, but it is sound. The pasture has not been grazed hard. The lawyers have it listed at a price I think we could manage if we put the smithy against it." "The smithy," she said. "I can move the smithy out here," he said. "Or I can set up the forge in the barn until we can build a proper structure. The business is good enough now that I can work from here and people will come. We are close enough to town that it is not a burden on them." He paused. "It would mean a proper ranch, cattle eventually, room to grow." She sat with this for a moment, looking at him across the table. She thought about her father and his 50 acres and his pistol and his practical love that had kept her alive through the worst years of her life. She thought about what it would mean to take those 50 acres and make them 170, to expand the life he had left her into something larger, to plant her children deeper in this soil. "I would want to see the lawyer's papers myself," she said. "All of them." "Of course," he said immediately. "And I want to understand the full terms before we agree to anything." "I would not have it any other way," he said, and meant it. She looked at him. "When do you want to go to San Antonio?" The smile that came across his face then was the one she had come to know as his most genuine expression of happiness, not the polite smile or the pleasant social smile, but the one that came from somewhere real and lit his whole face from inside. "End of the month," he said. "End of the month," she said. They went to San Antonio at the end of April, all 4 of them together, the wagon loaded for a 3-day trip. James, who was 12 by then and had developed opinions about most things including the proper management of travel, sat on the bench between his parents and narrated the landscape. And Thomas Edwin sat in the wagon bed, in a wooden box that Edwin had lined with blankets, and which served as a traveling containment unit for a small person who, if given freedom of the wagon, would immediately attempt to exit it. Thomas accepted this arrangement with the philosophical resignation of a person who recognizes he has no leverage. San Antonio in the spring of 1885 was a city that had been growing fast for a decade, the railroad having come through, and with it the particular energy of commerce and ambition that railroads bring. And James looked at it with the eyes of a boy who had grown up in a town of 240 people and was temporarily overwhelmed by the scale of things. They stayed at a boarding house on Commerce Street, clean and decent, and the next morning Ellen went to the lawyer's office with Edwin, and they spent 4 hours going through the Harlan estate papers with a thoroughness that the junior lawyer initially found mildly excessive, and then gradually came to understand was not going to abate. And they came away with a complete understanding of what they were buying and for what and under what terms, and the deal was struck, and the Harlan land was theirs. They walked out of the lawyer's office onto the San Antonio street in the warm afternoon sunshine, and Edwin shook her hand first and then, when she laughed at this, pulled her to him and held her, right there on the public street, and she let herself be held because she was a woman who had earned the right to be held on a public street in front of God and everyone if she wanted to be, and she wanted to be. They took James to see the Alamo on the afternoon before they left. It stood as it had stood for 50 years since the Battle of 1836, the old mission still solid in the middle of the city that had grown up around it, and they stood in front of it in the warm afternoon, and James looked at it with the solemnity that certain places summon in a thoughtful child. Ellen looked at it and thought about courage and stubbornness, and the particular human quality of refusing to yield even when yield is the only sensible thing, and she thought that she recognized something of this quality in herself, the years of not yielding, and she thought that stubbornness in the right cause was perhaps not so different from valor. Thomas Edwin, from his position in Edwin's arms, observed the Alamo with the equanimity of a 16-month-old, and then indicated he would like to be set down, which he was not, and then fell asleep on Edwin's shoulder, which was characteristic. They drove home with the deed to the Harlan land in her saddlebag, and arrived back in Redemption Creek in the late afternoon of the third day to find the farm exactly as they had left it, the house solid against the sky, the garden green with the spring growth, the east fence line running straight and clean toward the land that was now also theirs. The years after that were good. The ranch grew in the way that steady, honest work will cause a thing to grow, not with drama or sudden fortune, but with the accumulation of right decisions and consistent effort. Edwin moved the smithy to a building he and James built together on the south edge of the property in the summer of 1886, and the business continued, and the cattle that he bought in the fall of that year began to graze on the Harlan pasture, and the ranch took on the specific character of a working place that has been thought about carefully and built from what was actually there. James turned 16 in the summer of 1887 and grew into his height and was, Ellen thought, looking at him in the way she sometimes let herself look at her children when they were not paying attention, a remarkable person. He had her stubbornness and his dead father's quietness and Edwin's patience, which perhaps James had simply absorbed from years of proximity, and he had something entirely his own that she could not attribute to anyone, a quality of steadiness and humor together that made him easy to be with and trustworthy to rely on. He worked the ranch as though it were his own because it was, in every meaningful sense, and he and Edwin had developed the easy working relationship of two people who respect each other's competence without making a ceremony of it. Thomas Edwin was 4 and then 5 and then 6, and was in many ways the opposite of his brother, loud where James was quiet, quick where James was steady, fascinated by everything in the manner of a small person who has not yet discovered that they are supposed to be selective about their enthusiasms. He helped in the garden by pulling up every plant that he thought looked ready to be pulled up, which required some negotiation of standards. He helped in the barn by talking to the horses at length, which the horses appeared to enjoy. He told Edwin with great confidence what the cattle were thinking, and Edwin, with equal gravity, thanked him for the information. In 1888, Ellen had her third child, a daughter this time, and they named her Mary Ruth, for Edwin's mother and Ellen's grandmother. And James, who was now 15, received this news with the dignity of a young man who has developed sophisticated coping mechanisms. And Thomas Edwin, who was 4, went immediately to the door and looked out of it for some time processing the information, and then came back and said, "Is it a girl?" And upon being told yes, said, "All right," with the tone of a person who is accepting a trade on tolerable terms. Mary Ruth was, from her first weeks, entirely unintimidated by her brothers, which Ellen found gratifying. The town of Redemption Creek grew around them, the way towns in that era grew when the railroad was near and the land was productive, new families arriving, new buildings going up. The school expanded to 5 days a week and a new teacher hired. Martha Hale retired from the dry goods store and her son took it over. And the bank that had caused Ellen such difficulty in her early years changed ownership. And the new manager was a woman from Missouri who ran it with a crispness that Ellen found professionally admirable. Redemption Creek was not an easy or a gentle place. It was a West Texas town in the 1880s, and the world did not arrange itself to be fair to everyone who lived in it. And there were things Ellen saw that she knew were wrong and some that she could affect and some that she could not. And she tried to be clear about the difference and to do what she could in the category of could. She taught school twice a week for 3 years when the regular teacher was sick with a lung complaint that kept her fragile. And she taught reading to 4 children of a Mexican family who had come to settle in the land east of the creek, because they needed reading and she had it to give. And she thought her father would have approved of this. His pistol on her washstand and his stubbornness in her blood, and the instinct for useful action that she thought of as the truest inheritance he had given her. In the summer of 1889, James Collins, who was 17, announced that he had been offered a position with a surveying crew working the land north of San Antonio. Good work, skilled work, the kind that would travel and teach him things that the ranch could not. He came to her and Edwin together to tell them, sitting at the kitchen table where they had eaten 10,000 suppers, and he looked at them both with the earnestness of a young man asking permission that he has technically reached the age to not need. Ellen looked at her son and felt the complicated mathematics of a parent looking at a child who is ready to go. She had raised him to be capable, and here was the proof of it, and the proof was painful and wonderful in exactly equal measure. "Do you want to go?" she asked. "Yes," he said honestly, "I do, but I want you to know I am glad to stay if it is needed." "It is not needed," Edwin said and looked at Ellen, and she nodded. "Go," she said. "Go and learn what there is to learn and come back with it." James went. He came back for Christmas with calloused hands and new confidence and stories about the land north of San Antonio that he told at the table for 2 evenings straight. And Thomas Edwin, now 6, listened with the devotion of a boy who thinks his brother is the most interesting person alive. And Mary Ruth, 11 months old, sat in her chair and banged a spoon on the table and contributed to the atmosphere. The years continued, as years do, in their accumulation. Mary Ruth walked and then ran, and then climbed everything she was not supposed to climb, and a few things she was allowed to. And her personality revealed itself as a combination of Ellen's stubbornness and some quality of confident social ease that appeared to have come from Edwin's side of things, because she could charm the boots off anyone she met within approximately 4 minutes and remain entirely unself-conscious about having done so. Thomas Edwin at 8 and 9 was deep into the horses, a complete horseman in the making. And Edwin spent the winter evenings teaching him the care and management of the animals with a patience that Thomas, who was not always patient himself, had to work to match and generally did. It was in the fall of 1890, on an evening when James was home for a visit from his surveying work, now solidly 18 and looking more and more like a man, and less like the boy she kept seeing when she looked at him. That Ellen sat on the porch alone for a moment while the kitchen sounds came through the window, the voices of her husband and her children in the particular music of domestic life. And she thought about a morning 8 years ago when she had reached under a pillow and found nothing there and had been surprised by this and had asked herself why. The pistol was still on the washstand. She had never moved it from there. It was part of the house now, part of the specific gravity of the room, her father's hand and Thomas Collins's memory and 6 years of survival all contained in the weight of the iron and wood. She still cleaned it and still checked its loads because she was who she was, and because the land was what it was, and a woman did not stop being watchful simply because she was happy. But it was not protection from the dark anymore in the way it had been. It was history. It was a record. It was the evidence of where she had been. She thought about those 6 years with the clarity that time gives to things you have survived. She had been genuine in her survivorship. She had not been performing strength or making it more bearable than it was. She had been a woman alone with a child and a farm and a pistol under her pillow, and she had held the line every day through sheer, undramatic persistence, and there was nothing in her that wished she had done it differently or yielded earlier or let herself be easier to settle. Those years had made her exactly who she was, and who she was had been worth finding, apparently, to a man who was worth being found by. She heard the screen door behind her, and Edwin came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee, which was what he always brought when he came to find her in the evening, and she thought that she would probably be finding the bringing of coffee to be the most romantic gesture imaginable for the rest of her life, and that this was a fine thing to feel about a person. He sat beside her, and they drank their coffee, and the October night came down over the Texas land with its vault of stars, and the distant sound of coyotes on the north pasture, and the warm yellow light from the kitchen window behind them. And through the glass she could see James talking with his hands about something, and Thomas Edwin at the table listening, and Mary Ruth asleep in the chair by the fire the way she did sometimes after supper, simply closing her eyes wherever she happened to be, decisive even in sleep. "What were you thinking?" Edwin asked. "About the morning I put the pistol on the washstand," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What about it?" "I was thinking that I woke up that morning not knowing it had already happened," she said. "Not knowing that I had already decided. It was just there, the decision already made. And I asked myself why, and the answer was you, and I had not known it was you yet, not fully, but some part of me had known." He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, the same way she had leaned against his shoulder that November evening on the porch 8 years ago. Only now there was 8 years of marriage in the leaning, 8 years of shared mornings and difficult days and easy evenings and children and land, and all the texture of a life lived together. "I am glad I came to Redemption Creek," he said. "You have said that before," she said. "I will say it again," he said. "I expect I will say it for the rest of my life." She thought this was a good thing for a person to say and mean, and she said, "So will I." The night settled around them, warm and familiar, and theirs. The stars above Redemption Creek as vast and extraordinary as they had always been. The coyotes quiet now. The kitchen light warm through the glass. The whole of the life they had built together present in the weight of the night air, and the coffee cooling in her hands and the man beside her, and the sound of her children's voices through the wall. In the kitchen, James was telling Thomas about the shape of the land north of San Antonio, drawing it on the back of an envelope with the enthusiasm of a young man who has found his work and cannot quite believe it is real. Thomas was listening with the focused attention he brought to things he genuinely cared about, which was, to his mother's observation, quite different from the broad and cheerful enthusiasm he brought to everything else. Mary Ruth slept in her chair by the fire with the absolute commitment of early childhood, one hand curled under her cheek. Ellen set her coffee down on the porch rail and looked at the stars for a long time, the way she had looked at them all her life in this country, the way she had looked at them in the 6 hard years and in the better years that followed, And she thought about her father and Thomas Collins, and the life she had lost, and the life she had built, and the life she was still building. And she thought that none of it was simple and all of it was hers. And the pistol was on the washstand, and her husband was beside her, and her children were inside. And the land ran out in all directions in the dark, good, honest South Texas land, that she had worked with her hands and her persistence for more years than she could easily count. She was 39 years old. She was not finished. There were more mornings ahead than she could see from here, more seasons of planting and harvest, more repairs to make and meals to cook and conversations to have at the kitchen table, more evenings on the porch with the coffee and the stars. James would find his way and make his life and come home to tell her about it. Thomas Edwin would become the horseman he was clearly meant to be. Mary Ruth would grow into whatever extraordinary thing she was in the process of becoming, and the very thought of it made something bright and almost unbearable open up behind Ellen's ribs. And Edwin would be here on this porch bringing the coffee, fixing the things that needed fixing and noticing the things that needed noticing and looking at her like she was something worth looking at, which she now, after considerable time and evidence, believed. She picked up her coffee again and took a long sip. "Come inside soon," she said. "It is getting cold." "In a minute," he said. "I like it out here." "So do I," she said. "In a minute." They sat a while longer in the cold and the stars and the quiet that was not empty but full. The same quiet they had learned to sit inside together all those years ago. The silence of two people who have chosen each other and mean to keep choosing each other, which is not a single decision but a daily one, renewed in the small ordinary things, in the coffee and the harness repair, and the checking of fence lines, and the sitting on the porch when the night comes down over the vast Texas sky. The Colt Navy would be on the washstand when they went inside. The lamp would be burning in the kitchen and James would still be talking, and Thomas would still be listening, and Mary Ruth would still be sleeping in her chair, the small serious face of her father's daughter resting against her own small hand. And Ellen Collins, Edwin Easton now, Edwin Easton for 7 years and counting, would go inside and carry her daughter to bed, and kiss her sons good night, and stand in her bedroom and look at her father's pistol on the washstand, and understand again, as she understood every night now, that it meant something different than it used to mean, and that the difference was grace. She blew out the lamp in the kitchen and heard Edwin step behind her on the porch boards and the door closing on the cold night, and the house was warm and dark and full, and she was, to the bottom of everything she was made of, glad.